Whenever you're ready, Deja.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Case Western Reserve University School of Law. This is our first event for 2022, and it's a big one. We have 425 people joining us on Zoom, and there are several in the moot courtroom. This event is a lecture entitled Nazi Laws from Democracy to Dictatorship to Genocide. And it's a wonderful event for us because of our history as a law school with respect to Nuremberg and war crimes trials. Let me give you a little bit of that history. A lot of you may not know, but about 50 years ago, we had a faculty member named Sidney Jacoby, who had been a Nuremberg prosecutor who taught on our faculty. He then brought in another Nuremberg prosecutor named Henry King, who was a member of our faculty for 30 years and the head of our Canada-US Law Institute. Henry then brought me to the law school in part because my expertise and experience is also in war crimes. And I established our Henry King War Crimes Research Office, which in 2005 was nominated by the chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone for the Nobel Peace Prize for the work that our students and faculty did to assist in the prosecution of Charles Taylor and other war criminals in that horrible conflict. Then when I became co-dean, I brought in Jim Johnson, who had been a prosecutor at the Special Court for Sierra Leone and is now the chief prosecutor of the residual Special Court for Sierra Leone. He runs our War Crimes Research Office, and his students continue to do work on a number of projects for international tribunals around the world. He also started our Yemen Accountability Project, in which 70 of our students are currently working to document the atrocities in the conflict in Yemen for a future Nuremberg-type prosecution someday. So for us to be doing this particular lecture as the first one of 2022 is extraordinarily appropriate. And we are really happy to have joining that long list of professors with expertise in this area, Kathy Mansfield. Let me tell you a little bit about Kathy, who you see at the front there. She's a member of the prestigious American Law Institute. She came to our law school a couple of years ago, having been a tenured law professor at Drake University Law School. She teaches many courses, including a very popular course on Nuremberg and the law. And she is so full of interesting things that she does, including that she is the composer and producer of an opera about the Holocaust, which will be performed this spring at our Maltz Performing Arts Center here in Cleveland. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Kathy, and I hope you enjoyed today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Michael. I just want to say how delighted I am to have joined the group here at Case Western Reserve, and it's such a privilege to cover this material in the context of a university that focuses on these kinds of issues so deeply. So what I'm going to do today is we're waiting for the PowerPoint slide deck to come up, but I'm going to take us through the political and legal history, not very deeply because of, you can only cover so much in an hour, but basically through the history leading up to the Nazi regime. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the court structure during the Nazi regime, and also a key judicial opinion that came out interpreting the Nuremberg laws. So with that, let's go. Eric, I'm advancing the slides, yes? Okay, I think we need to go off Zoom and onto it's not advancing, so. There we go. Okay, and these, as you can see, these slides are very dense with words because words matter when you're talking about legislation. And of course, they're so far away over there, I can't see them. So I'm going to turn around sometimes, for which I apologize. So just a very, very brief, longer history of Germany. Germany had been made up of lots of different states. From 1871 until 1918, it was ruled by 3 Kaisers. And the one that we're going to focus on for a second is Kaiser Wilhelm II. That's him in the picture on the right there. And Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated right at the end of World War I, right before the armistice was signed, and he then exiled himself to the Netherlands. Still not advancing. Thank you. And is there some way to get rid of the Zoom stuff? The technology of being both live and on Zoom at the same time. So a little bit about World War I, because World War I really set the stage for the Nazi regime and for the Holocaust ultimately. By the way, I should mention it's International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is why we're doing this lecture today. So World War I, which, as you all probably know, ran from 1914 to 1918. Was carried out under Kaiser Wilhelm II. It was primarily fought in the rest of Europe off German soil. And so, this is before the days of YouTube Live, of course. And so people really didn't really have a visceral understanding of what exactly was happening during World War I. And so the German citizens tended to think that it was going better than it actually was. And so when the war came to an end, to the German populace's mind quite suddenly, there was this sense of like, oh my gosh, what happened? How could we have ended up in this situation when the war was purportedly going so well for Germany? And then that led to kind of a dissolution of the social fabric of Germany in a way, and to this stabbed in the back theory, which you sometimes hear about. The stabbed in the back theory is this idea that Germany would have won the war, except that it was stabbed in the back by domestic interests, as opposed to being defeated by international interests. And those domestic interests that supposedly stabbed Germany in the back were Jews and communists. And so that, and Marxists, many of whom were Jews, and that kind of permeated the German psyche around the end of the war. There was also a really bad situation at home. So the German soldiers were coming back from the front from World War I to find their families, without food, without heat. And so the situation in Germany was really quite bad. To top that off, there was this political disintegration of the political system that had existed up until that point through the Kaisers. And so Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated. There's a couple books that I highly recommend, one by Ben Hett that really digs deep into this period. But basically, the Social Democratic Party, which was at the time the largest party, announced that they were going to create a new government, a constitutionally based government. And Frederick Ebert would be the first chancellor. And this becomes an issue at the founding of the Nazi government, because there were certainly the more conservative members of German society felt that this constitutional government known as the Weimar Republic, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that it was kind of an illegitimate government because it was kind of created out of whole cloth at the end of World War I. So so you get the Germans, ending the war and then electing this National Assembly to draft this constitution. But at the same time, the populace starts really splitting into two camps: to the left, the Marxist communist side, and to the right, to the conservative nationalist side. And there's really not much in the middle. And you start getting these rebellions all over Germany, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, that are quite violent. There's a lot of, there are deaths, there are injuries. And so you just get this really sort of social upheaval through this time. One of the rebellions, as it says up there, was in January 1919 in Berlin, the Spartacist left-wing rebellion. There was another left-wing attempt to take over Munich in April of 1919. That was put down by government troops and by mercenary soldiers called the Freikorps. And I think we have a little video here about that. Oh, maybe not. Okay, so then the Weimar Constitution was then signed into law in August of 1919. And do I need to click the link or just go on to the next? Okay. So here's a short video about that. Whoop. Can you, thanks.
February 1919. In Weimar, once home to Goethe and Schiller, the fall of the emperor paves the way for a freely elected National Assembly of the First German Republic. Democracy is completely new for many citizens.
As we would erinnern, I can remember my relatives speaking of a woman, a teacher's widow, who had volunteered to put up 3 delegates. Als gesprochen wurde, die hatte 3 Abgeordnete freiwillig auf. Da sagte man, and they were saying, how can this lady take such people into her home?
The delegates come to Weimar because there's unrest in Berlin. In 1918, the Great War had been lost. The emperor had been overthrown, and now the communists are hustling for power. In January 19, there's an uprising. It is crushed brutally. For the first time, women are allowed to both stand and vote in this election of the National Assembly. Parties pushing for a parliamentary republic receive a 2/3 majority. The SPD becomes the strongest party. Its leader, Friedrich Ebert, becomes the first president of the Weimar Republic. After many months of deliberation, the delegates enact the so-called Weimar Constitution. Germany becomes a democratic republic. The government is no longer responsible to the emperor, but to parliament. For the first time in German history, government authority emanates from the people. The Constitution follows on from the failed revolution of 1848 and the ideals of the Paulskirche Assembly. Black, red, and gold, representing the German liberal tradition, are the chosen colors of the Weimar Republic. But the new state must bear the consequences of the war. The Treaty of Versailles allows victors to dictate their terms. Germany loses 1/7 of its territory and must pay reparations.
Everyone called it the shameful Treaty of Versailles. Of course, without having read the many hundreds of paragraphs, there was great unanimity against the Versailles Treaty.
Protests are also directed against the Republic. Supposedly, the Democrats and Socialists abandoned the victorious troops, the so-called stab in the back. The lie proves effective. Already in the first elections to the Reichstag in June 1920, the government parties of the Weimar Republic, the Social Democrats, Catholic Center Party, and the left liberals lose their majority. They would never regain this power. From the very beginning, also in Parliament, the young democracy faces determined opposition.
I like to use these historical videos because there's really nothing that replaces seeing the actual thing. I could talk about it all day and it's not as good. The Weimar Constitution gets signed into law And the only point of what I'm about to go through is to show that there was a separation of powers, that there was a check on powers, there was a balance of powers. It differs from our Constitution in some ways, but I think it's important to see that it was an interrelated Constitution that had those basic notions that we think of. So there was a presidency. The president was to be elected by popular election for a term of 7 years. The president's eligible for re-election, recall by popular vote, called by a 2/3 majority of the Reichstag. There's a separate position called the chancellor, appointed by the president. This is, of course, the position that Hitler takes initially. The chancellor presides over the government of the Reich and conducts its affairs. The chancellor also determines the political program. There's also Reich ministers, which are kind of like cabinet ministers. They're recommended by the Reich chancellor, appointed and dismissed by the president. And again, the key point of all this is that there's actually like a structure to the government. There's two houses of parliament, the Reichstag and the Reichsrat. The Reichstag is elected by universal, equal, direct, and secret suffrage, including women over 20 years of age. Seats are allotted to the parties based on the vote they get in the election. The term is 4 years. They can pass laws by a simple majority. The Reichsrat, which is kind of the equivalent of our Senate, is elected by the parliaments of the 18 German states, which, you know, is historically how our Senate had been elected. One representative for each state. Large states get one for every million voters. Legislation has a process it has to go through. So for those of you that are in my LLR class, you know, we're talking about that here. Basically, the Reich cabinet was supposed to introduce legislation with the concurrence of members of the Reichsrat or the Reichstag. It was enacted by the Reichstag. Once adopted, it could be protested by the equivalent of the Senate. The president could call for a referendum on things that were passed. So there's this very complicated process for passing laws and overriding the passage of the laws and going back and rethinking about it. The Constitution also provided that it could only be amended if 2/3 of the members were present and 2/3 of those present consented to the amendment. This becomes important later because the way Hitler first starts to take over is he arrests some of the members of the parliament and then gets legislation passed. So we'll get to that in just a minute. And then there's this Article 48. We have nothing really like this. Article 48, which ended up kind of, I guess, being the embedded time bomb for the Weimar Republic, says that in the event the public order and security are seriously disturbed or endangered, the Reich president may take the measures necessary for their restoration, intervening if necessary with the aid of the armed forces. For this purpose, he may temporarily abrogate, wholly or in part, the fundamental principles laid down in the articles of the Constitution, and those included liberty, house as a sanctuary, secrecy of individual communication, freedom of expression and no censorship, right to assembly, right of non-criminal association, and the right to private property. So this gives an enormous amount of power to the president to declare an emergency and start taking away what we consider to be civil liberties or civil rights. And then there were some protections for this, which was that the president had to give notice to the Reichsrat, and then they could, if they wanted to, override or annul what the president had done. Interestingly, and then Article 25, the president could dissolve the Reichstag, but only once for the same cause, and there had to be a new election within 60 days. So, you know, there's all these protections built around the structure of this government to keep it from returning to either a monarchy or a dictatorship. It's important to note President Ebert, the first president, used Article 48 136 times. So that's pretty amazing. They were sometimes for good reasons and real emergencies, and sometimes they were for political reasons. That is also important because that sets a precedent for using Article 48 that also becomes important later on. This is stuff I think most people studied in high school about the currency inflation. You probably may remember from your high school history textbook the picture of the wheelbarrow with somebody going to buy a loaf of bread with a wheelbarrow of cash. So, you know, the early 20s were rough for Germany. Again, you had, you know, these violent rebellions. The Cat Putsch was in March of 1920. That was a conservative nationalist attempt to overthrow the constitutional government. And the army refused to defend the government, but basically Ebert was able to convince the general workers in Berlin to go on strike to put down the rebellion, and that worked. Then, you know, you have this first election of the representatives of the Reichstag as all this stuff is going on. In 1921, reparations for that Germany had to pay for World War I were set, and they were very onerous. Germany was not able to meet those reparation requirements. And as a result, France placed some soldiers in the Ruhr Valley, and things got very, very contentious between France and Belgium versus Germany. And then at the urging of the government, German workers went on strike to protest what they considered to be this invasion by Belgian and French folks, you know, simply because Germany didn't have the wherewithal to make its reparations payments. Germany supported the striking workers by printing money, which was a bad idea. That resulted in really, really serious hyperinflation that completely devalued the value of the mark, which was the currency of the Weimar Republic. And you can see that in November of 23, a dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Ebert used Article 48 to deal with the economic situation, the economic crisis 63 times. So again, you can see this heavy use of Article 48, Article 48, excuse me. Then in November of 23, you get the famous beer hall putsch, and we're going to watch a little film about that.
In Munich in 1923, in the atmosphere of crisis caused by the occupation of the Ruhr, Hitler and the Nazis acted. Hitler stood on the stage of the Bürgerbräukeller on November the 8th and interrupted a right-wing political meeting. He called for a national revolution to start in Bavaria and overthrow the left-wing government in Berlin. The next day, the Nazis, together with other right-wing parties, marched through Munich to gain support. They were stopped by the police at the war memorial at the Feldherrnhalle. The Nazis hoped the army and police, many of whom supported right-wing parties, would join them in a march on Berlin.
Kommen dann in die Maximilianstraße überkreuzen wir. Dann in der Residenz kommen dann wird die Schüsse vor.
The police didn't support them. Shots were fired, and the marchers were routed. Hitler fled from the scene. 4 policemen and 16 Nazis lost their lives.
Ich habe mal gefragt, was ich da für Emotionen gehabt habe. Da möchte ich sagen, ja, da wäre eigentlich die ersten politischen Emotionen gehabt, wie etwas schief gehen kann. Es war schon ein Schlag für mich und für viele meiner Kameraden, dass das passieren wird.
That is from a wonderful documentary called The Nazis: A Warning from History. It's a 6 CD set, so it's a really, really good in-depth documentary. Hitler then is tried for his participation in this rebellion. He's given a pretty light sentence, and his sentence is reduced. And while he's in jail, he writes Mein Kampf, which is his sort of political, plans for Germany, as well as quite evidently full of anti-Semitic hatred. But then in May, the Nazi Party starts to actually make some showings in the elections. And then you can see that, they keep increasing in their representation in the legislature. In the mid-1920s, things get a little bit better in Germany. There's some changes to the reparations system that gives a little bit of relief to Germany. So then in 25, President Paul von Hindenburg is elected as president. He remains president during the transition to the Nazi government, and I'll talk about him more later. He was a traditional conservative. He really felt like the Weimar democracy was an illegitimate government. And he used Article 48 a lot of times. Sometimes he would dissolve the government and call for new elections. And then you can see in 28, the Nazi Party got 12 seats. But then in 1929, the economy worldwide tanked again, including in the United States. So it was the beginning of the Great Depression. A bunch of banks in Germany failed. I think five banks collapsed. There's another presidential election in 32, and Hitler runs to be president, but he's beat by Hindenburg. And then in July of 1932, for the first time, the Nazis become the majority political party. And I think what's important about all this is that it's all through elections, right? So, but of course you have not just two parties like we do, you have many, many parties. So you can win without getting more than 50% of the vote. January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. So now Hitler's in one of the top two executive positions. And here's another short film about that. So that was the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, and that was a torchlight parade in celebration of Hitler being appointed chancellor. And in another lecture I give, where I actually show some photos of a lot of the department stores in Berlin were owned by Jewish families, and a lot of the windows were broken on those stores that night and stuff like that. Okay, so Hitler becomes chancellor, and right away he asked Hindenburg to dissolve the government and hold another election, which Hindenburg agrees to do. Hindenburg's quite old by this time; he's in his early 80s. And on February 4th, there's this presidential decree issued. It's called the Decree for the Protection of the German People, and it bans political meetings, marches, restricts the press, gives police expanded powers of arrest, and all of that is in anticipation of the March 5th election. One of the things that I think is worth noting about this presidential decree is the title, right? Words matter, and this isn't, described as a decree in anticipation of the upcoming election or something. It's for the protection of the German people. So this is the beginning of this series of legislation that is titled and sort of resounds with these words that make it seem like the real Germans are under attack from those who would harm them, and that all these measures are necessary to preserve the life and well-being of real Germans. So that's the first thing that happens. Now, this is February of 1933. The election was scheduled for March 5th. But before the election could take place, on February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag, which is where the legislature met, burned to the ground. So I think the next thing I have is some video of the damage, and then we'll talk about what happened with that.
There you see the Reichstag, the German House of Parliament in Berlin, which has been seriously destroyed by fire. The main hall in which the deputies conducted their debate has suffered most from the conflagration. And after the general election, which is about to take place, Parliament will have to find a temporary home elsewhere. Paying for no respect of the person, and President Hindenburg's own chair was also destroyed. Hitler, now Chancellor, has announced that the power is the work of communists, communist uprising throughout the country. Consequence, Germany has been placed under a system of martial law, a decree having been signed which aims at the total destruction of communism.
So the Reichstag fire was purportedly set by communists, including a man named van der Lubbe, and in a minute we're going to see part of his trial. But regardless of who said it, it served as the pretext for the first major decree that was really the step onto the slide into the Nazi regime. And that was, it's called the Reichstag Fire Decree. You'll notice it was issued under Article 48, paragraph 2. So it was the declaration of emergency by President von Hindenburg. It took away the right to assembly, free speech, free press. It removed restraints on police investigations. It allowed the Gestapo to take people into something called protective custody. So that was like if they were it was thought that they were going to commit a crime, they could be arrested and placed in protective custody. And similarly, the criminal police, the local police, got the right to hold people in something called preventive detention, which was similar. It was like, you know, we think you're going to commit a crime or a violent act, and so we're going to take you into custody. It gave the central government authority to overrule state and local laws and made punishment more severe, including death replacing a life sentence. And it was, if you read the text, which I actually have my students do in the Holocaust and the Law class, it's framed as a defensive measure against communist acts of violence. So again, you get this constant like beat of this drum that like we're under attack and we need to defend ourselves. The election goes forward on March 5th, just a few days later. But of course, by now, the police have gone out and raided communists and arrested people using the preventive detention rules. And so, those people obviously can't vote. But in the March 5th election, the Nazis got 44% of the vote. And then between them and the right-wing nationalists, they were able to get a majority. This is a picture of Hitler listening to the election results at his radio. Okay, so again, February 28th is the Reichstag fire, March 5th is the election, and then on March 24th, Hitler got the president to issue this enabling act, and it's called the Law to Remedy the Distress of the People in the Reich. Again, same kind of language. It basically takes the Reichstag's legislative power and it transfers it to Hitler. So, mind you, there's other parts of government, right? There's the president, there's the Reichsrat, there's the power that the states had. Those aren't affected yet, but it does take the Reichstag's power, the main legislative body, and turns it over to Hitler, to the chancellor. It says laws and constitutions can be changed without permission by the Reichstag or the president, so it marginalizes them. They can deviate for the constitution. All laws are effective the day after they're passed. And it passed the Reichstag, and I'm sorry, I said before that it was issued by the president. That was a misstatement. It was passed by the Reichstag by a vote. And it was after they detained all 81 of the communist members of the Reichstag and 26 of the 120 social democrats. So if you do the math, basically they were still following the constitutional rules on 2/3 majority of 2/3 of the legislature. And again, I think this is really important because throughout the entire Nazi regime, you get the Nazi governments doing these things like by the book, if you will. Now, is arresting, a majority of your opponents by the book? No, but technically this legislation passed following the constitutional limits. The next thing that happened was the law for imposition of the death penalty. This is called the Lex van der Lubbe law. He was the guy who was convicted of setting the Reichstag fire. And again, it diverges from the constitutional protections that the Weimar Constitution had provided, because it applies the death penalty retroactively to him. It was applied by the German Supreme Court retroactively to him. What's interesting is they did not apply it to other Reichstag fire defendants retroactively. This kind of pissed Hitler off, and Hitler later, as a result of his distrust of what the regular German courts would do, created something called the People's Court, which was a court to try political cases, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. By the way, this is just kind of an interesting late note, but he was exonerated in 2008. Van der Lubbe was exonerated by the German government in 2008. Okay, this is his trial, just a bit of his trial.
Inside the German Supreme Court, by a letter on trial for a crime that helped Adolf Hitler at his parking car. The first being let in, and manacled after 8 days before the court, is Baroness van der Lubbe, 24-year-old Holliger, has confessed. The others are German and Bulgarian communists. Charged with setting fire to the Berlin Reichstag building, they have been in jail 7 months. The case has stirred up controversy all over the world. Here is the Reichstag building, now being rebuilt. Flames started in 4 places, ruining the giant gilded cupola. Flames caused more than $1 billion damage. Bundles of rags, bugs, and shaving packets soaked in gasoline to start the fire. Police saw her leaving the building and fired on. Van der Lubbe was named. These pictures, the first ever made for the German Supreme Court, show the Reichstag case in progress. Emily Gardner, Vasco Constantino Sonnet, Bulgarian communist. Ernst Kosler, Center, a leader of the German Communist Party, another defendant. Communist or Nazi, the world awaits the answer.
It's interesting. So it was a bronze copula to the Reichstag building, and when Germany unified, they put a glass dome over the building to signify transparency in government, and it's a really interesting place to visit if you ever go to Berlin. Okay, so we're only 2 months into Hitler being chancellor at this point, not even, and one of the very first things that he does is start issuing decrees that relate to restricting Jews. So one of the very first ones was a boycott of Jewish businesses. It happened on April 1st, 1933. There are tons of pictures of this event. It's really interesting as a researcher in this area. There's lots and lots of pictures in the early days. And then after the war starts in September of 39, there's a lot less pictures. And by the time the deportation of Jews starts in 1941, there's almost no pictures. There's some pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. There's a couple of pictures of deportations in towns in Germany, but a lot of the international photographers had already left town. But this is, of all the pictures I have of this event, I think the creepiest one. This is actually a photographer that was stationed by the government in front of a Jewish business so that anyone who went in to defy the boycott had their picture taken. And so it's, this sort of, we know that you're a Jew lover kind of thing. And then this is a film of the boycott as well. Sorry about the music. So people always ask me why that sign is in English and German, and I do not know the answer, other than they just wanted to make sure that, you know, the United States and England knew that this was going on. I really don't know, but I think it's very interesting that the sign is in German as well as English. Okay, so also in April, a few days later, you get something called the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. Again, the title is really interesting because it's like the restoration to German values. We're going to get rid of people who we don't want in our government. So civil servants are unfit if they've served in the Communist Party or they've aided the Communist Party. And then civil servants of non-Aryan descent are also supposed to be retired. You're non-Aryan if you descend from non-Aryans, very specific, especially Jewish parents or grandparents. So as a result of this, a lot of, and there's a separate section for former political activity against the government. A lot of civil servants were fired at this point. So, you know, this is a letter of a woman who is being dismissed from her position as the principal of a public high school because she's Jewish. Okay, so there was also a law concerning admission to the bar. I thought, I mean, there's tons of these laws, so I just had to pick a few, and I thought this would, obviously for a law audience, this is an interesting one. So the admission to the bar of attorneys who are non-Aryan can be revoked. But it's really interesting to note, in a lot of these early statutes have this exception. If you served in World War I, or you were in Germany during World War I, you were sometimes excluded from coverage of the law. There's, you can see at the bottom here, Saul Friedlander, who wrote a terrific book called Nazi Germany and the Jews. His statistics show that of the 4,585 Jewish lawyers practicing in Germany, 3,167 were allowed to continue. And a lot of judges and prosecutors were also allowed to continue in their job because they had, they met the exception of being already admitted to the bar on August 1, 1914, so before World War I started. These are just some pictures of, there was a procedure for petitioning for readmission to the bar if you had been kicked out, and these are Jewish lawyers lining up to petition to be readmitted. That's also Berlin. All these anti-Jewish measures caused people in the United States to get up in arms. You know, there's a large Jewish presence in the United States, particularly, you know, in cities like New York and Cleveland and Chicago. So this is actually organization of at Public Hall in you know, to protest what was going on in Germany. And Public Auditorium still downtown, so that's the same room that's down there. And then I've given this talk in Chicago too. So the next one is actually a parade in Chicago. I'll just show you 2 seconds of that. People who actually live in Chicago are more interested in this. It moves very slowly. Okay, so the last thing left to do to give Hitler complete power is to eliminate the states, eliminate the Reichsrat, and eliminate the president. Because right now Hitler's chancellor and he has the legislative authority of the Reichstag. So that all happens in early 1934. They dissolve all the state parliaments in January. In February, they dissolve the Reichsrat. Only thing that's left now is Hindenburg in the presidency. He's really old. He's on his deathbed. And the next thing, well, not quite on his deathbed, but he dies soon thereafter. So he remains president. I think Hitler had this gift, I guess you could say, of knowing just how far he could push before there would be pushback. And I think that there was this sense that messing with Hindenburg, who was, you know, been around for a long time, he was a nationalist, he had a lot of support from people on the right, that would be too much. And so he waited until the night before Hindenburg died. And the night before Hindenburg died, he promulgated the law regarding the sovereign head of the German Reich. It consolidated the office of president with the chancellor. It transferred the authority of president to the Führer and Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler, and it was effective on Hindenburg's death. And so when he died the next day, Hitler now had all the political power in Germany, all of it, which, if you think about it, is quite a constitutional feat, right? I mean, you have this, you saw what the Constitution looked like. It had all these checks and balances, and, you know, it's just gone. Interestingly, Hitler continued to have elections that were just sort of plebiscites, like endorsements of what he had done. But of course, you know, by now, a lot of people are being arrested. The communists are arrested. You know, you can't vote if you're Jewish. So it doesn't mean much. So again, August 1st, 1934 is when Hindenburg dies. And then one of the first things that Hitler does, and this shows you how important attorneys and judges are to a political system, is he does something called the coordination of the bench and the bar. So in 1919, the oath that lawyers took was, "I swear loyalty to the Constitution, obedience to the law, and conscientious fulfillment of the duties of my office, so help me God." Right after Hindenburg dies, they changed that oath to, "I swear I will be true and obedient to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, observe the law, and conscientiously fulfill the duties of my office, so help me God." And then also German judges took an oath to Hitler rather than to the Constitution. Then all professional associations at all affiliated with the law were merged into a single organization, the National Socialist League of German Jurists. This happened in other professions as well, where there was like a unification of everybody in the profession. Okay, so then that was all 1934. 1935, you get the Nuremberg Laws, which most people have heard of already. The Nuremberg Laws are called that because they were adopted in Nuremberg. There were actually two of them. One was defining who is a citizen of the Reich, and the second prohibited marriages and extramarital sexual relations between Jews and German nationals. First one is called the Reich Citizenship Law. The second one, consistent with the titles we've been seeing, is called the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. And again, they're called the Nuremberg Laws. We're just going to watch a teeny tiny part of this next film. This is the actual announcement of the Nuremberg Laws at the Nazi Party conference in Nuremberg, where they were issued. So we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. Okay, the Reich Citizenship Law, it's the part that's, I think, the most important is Article 2. It's only a subject who is of German or kindred blood and who through his conduct shows he's both willing and able to faithfully serve the German people and the Reich, and only those people have full political rights. And then in Article 3, it gives the Reich Minister of the Interior, along with the Führer, to do implementing regulations, what we would call implementing regulations in the United States. So, and then the Law for Protection of German Blood and Honor basically forbid marriages between Jews and Germans and forbid sexual intercourse except in marriage between Jews and Germans. Now, this becomes important because in a minute, I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court case that interpreted this statute. It also, by the way, it prohibited Jews from employing female Germans below age 45. So that just like perpetuates this notion that, you know, Jewish men are you know, going to lust after and defile young German women. You can't display the Reich flag, but you can display the Jewish flag. So, you know, all these kind of restrictions that separate who is a German and who's not a German. The first regulation is issued, and it's the first time they define who a Jew is. I talk about this a lot in my Holocaust in the Law class. But it's anyone who descends from at least 3 grandparents who are fully Jewish. Also anyone who descends from two fully Jewish grandparents if they're observant, basically, if they belong to the religious community. We talk about this more extensively in my class, but we talk about this notion of Judaism as like a blood thing, as it's that it's like something that's in your blood. But then if that's true, why would you change the definition based on who belongs to the community, chooses to belong to the community? But anyway, that's our first definition of who a Jew is. And then we get Article 11 that says extramarital relations in the sense of paragraph 2 of the law only refers to sexual relations. Okay, again, that becomes important in the Supreme Court case. There's tons of other restrictions on Jews. You can go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's website and they have a date list of all the restrictions. These are just some examples. That picture on the top left, that's actually a post-war picture, but I use it in my lectures because of the bench that says nicht für Juden, which means not for Jews. Certain benches were for Jews, certain were not. The Jewish stars, of course, most people know about that. That actually didn't come into play until 1941 or 42, depending on where you were. You'd have a J stamped on your passport if you were Jewish. You'll see it's Clara Sarah. All Jewish women had to add the name Sarah to their names as their middle name. All Jewish men had to add the name Israel as their middle name. There were certain streets Jews couldn't walk on. At some point, they had to turn their pets over to the government. They had to turn over all their jewelry. First, they had to inventory their jewelry and turn in the inventory. And then a few months later, they seized all the jewelry. So, there's just this increasing constant drumbeat of anti-Jewish legislation. Okay, before the Nazi regime, doesn't that look like our court system? It does. The court system in Germany before the Nazi regime looked like ours. Local courts, district courts, courts of appeals, and a Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in 1936 was asked to interpret the Nuremberg laws. So the judge who did that, who became a defendant in the Nuremberg trials, he committed suicide. I got him mixed up with another guy. So he began serving as a judge in 1907. He became the Chief Justice in 1929, and then he committed suicide in April of 1945. Okay, so we have all these statutes that say basically the Jews and Germans can't marry, they can't have sex. We have a definition of who a Jew is. We have the first regulation that defines extramarital relations to mean sexual relations. And so what the court was called on, what the Supreme Court of Germany, was to decide what does sexual relations mean. And what is shocking to me about this case and to my students who I have read this case is how it reads just like one of our cases. There's never anything where they step back and say anything about what's going on here, right? That you're basically sorting the German populace into the real Germans and the fake Germans or the Jews. And instead they just interpret the narrow legal question at hand. The question of law, which is to be decided by the Great Senate upon the appeal of the state's attorney for the first criminal senate in 2 pending cases, is posed as follows: whether the term sexual relations in the context of Article 11 of the first ordinance, blah, 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 is to be understood as referring only to intercourse, acts similar to intercourse, or illicit sexual acts. That's the question they have to decide. And in the holding, they say the term sexual relations in the context of the Nuremberg law does not include every kind of illicit sexual action, but is also not restricted to sexual intercourse alone. It includes the entire range of natural and unnatural sexual relations that, in addition to sexual intercourse, includes all other sexual activities with a member of the opposite sex, that according to the nature of the activities are intended to serve as a substitute for sexual intercourse and satisfying the sexual needs of a partner. Why did they hold this? What's their reasoning for the opinion? Again, it looks like something you'd see in any legislative interpretation. You look at the words chosen by the drafters, which in German's a very specific language. And so they look at that. Look at the words in question in the context of the whole law. What's the intent of the law? Is this starting to sound like our class, right? Starting to sound like LLR in here, right? But it's, you look at the intent of the legislation. What is the intent or purpose of the law? It's the protection of German blood, but also the protection of German honor, which is why sexual intercourse is not the only thing covered, right? If blood was the only thing covered, we'd be concerned about body fluids being exchanged, but we are concerned also about German honor. Okay, so the regular German courts stayed part of the court system all through the Nazi regime. But in addition to that, Hitler created these special courts, again, in part because he was dissatisfied with the refusal of the Supreme Court to retroactively punish the defendants from the Reichstag fire with death. So I'm going to talk about each one of these. And this is a quote from the Nuremberg trials: "The most crucial and radical change in the judicial system under the Third Reich was the establishment of various extraordinary courts. These irregular tribunals permeated the entire judicial structure and eventually took over all judicial business which touched political issues or were related to the war." So the first one was the special courts. They were the first ones created in March 21, 1933. They were specifically there to adjudicate the offenses listed in the Reichstag decree. They had 34 of them. It was to combat anti-Nazi activity. There was one president and 2 associate judges, no appeal at all. The chief judge here was, or one of the judges was Oswald Rottag. He was admitted in 26. He was serving in Nuremberg. And he was actually the presiding judge in the Katz defiling case, which I'll talk about, in Katzenberger case, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then in the Katzenberger opinion, which was again this case where he sentenced a Jewish man for having sex with, Jewish man for having sex with a non-Jewish woman, when there was actually no evidence. He said the political form of life of the German people under National Socialism is based on the community. One fundamental factor of the life of the national community is the racial problem. If a Jew commits racial pollution with a German woman, this amounts to polluting the German race, and by polluting a German woman, to a grave attack on the purity of German blood. The need for protection is particularly strong. So you get the tenor of the special courts. The Katzenberger case, again, the facts of this case were that Irene Seiler, who you see there testifying in the Nuremberg trials after the war, her father had been friends with Katzenberger. So he was like 30 or 35 years her senior. She and he both testified that they did not have a sexual relationship at all, but they were very fond of each other. I guess he had known her since she was a little girl. And the charge was that they had violated 2 statutes. One was the race defilement law, and the other was a law that increased sentences if you took advantage of war conditions. And so what they said was that basically, because they had gone to see each other when there were blackouts during bombings, that was taking advantage of wartime conditions. They both testified that there was no sexual relationship of any kind between them. And then here's the charges against them, that they violated, like I said, the law for the protection of German blood and honor. And then they also violated the Folkpest law with the special circumstances. They were also charged with perjury. Katzenberger was sentenced to death. Seiler was sentenced to 2 years hard labor and loss of her civil rights. Again, this is the special courts, but they go through this whole thing about whether Katzenberger is Jewish or not. It reads just like any finding of fact. here's what his parents were, here's his grandma, here's, you know, the whole family line. Then they go through her family line, you know, here's why she's German blood. And then the evidence is they visited each other frequently. She accepted gifts of money. She sat on his lap and they kissed. And then they go on to conjecture about what else could have been going on. They took advantage of wartime conditions, and that Seiler is guilty of perjury because she denies any of this. The court finds that it's sexual in nature, and, you know, without going, I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to shorthand this, but basically they sentence him to death and her to prison time. There was actually Der Stürmer was the Nazi newspaper, which was vehemently anti-Semitic. And what they said about it was the world Jewry will discover that Germany knows how to defend herself with the severe measures against Jewish race defilers. Now it will again write using the old long-tried tactics about the medieval conditions prevailing in Germany. It will again glorify those poor, deplorable, harmless Jews who become the victims of National Socialist legislation. It will give vent to spite and malice towards Germany. So again, it's like shifting who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, right? You see that in all this stuff. The People's Court was created to try treason cases. You may have actually heard of the People's Court and not know it because it tried some of the famous cases. So there was an attempt on Hitler's life in 1944. That case was tried in the People's Court. The White Rose case was tried in the People's Court. Again, if you take my class, we actually watch a film about that trial. The chief judge of the People's Court was a guy named Roland Freisler. He's known as Raving Roland, and you'll see why in a second. He had been a lawyer since 1922. He was killed when a bomb fell on the People's Court in 1945. This is footage of him during the trial of the conspirators to assassinate Hitler. Oh, no, it's not. The next page is about the White Rose case. So this is actually the White Rose group. Here we go. Okay, and then the last court, and then I'll start taking questions, was the Hereditary Health Court. I could do a whole lecture on the Hereditary Health Court. You may have heard, and it's true, that the first victims of the Nazi regime were people with physical and mental defects. Actually, the scientific backing for this came from the United States originally. But of course, it was based on this notion that to have a citizenry that's pure blood, you have to eliminate any defects in the genetic material that's, you know, circulating in the population. So this was, the purpose here was to force sterilization of anyone with a hereditary disease, and hereditary diseases included things like, you know, deafness that came on in adulthood, that, you know, it was a pretty expansive list. And also, you know, a tendency towards criminality that could be handled under that statute. So it was really given an expansive definition. Okay, so that's what I got. I'm happy to take whatever questions anyone in the room has, and I'll also take a look at the questions. Yeah.
So if the, oh, sorry. if the Jewish businesses were boycotted starting in 1933, so did that really stick, or what
Yeah,
happened that
it's a good
allowed
question.
Jews to continue to live in Germany into the 40s?
Yeah, so actually it didn't stick. It was it was never like officially rescinded, but it was more like a day-long kind of focus. There was pushback from the United States. And so Jewish businesses for a few years were able to keep operating. The next thing that happened, though, was that Jewish businesses were Aryanized, which was the forced sale of Jewish businesses at deeply discounted prices. For businesses that had a Jewish owner with non-Jewish employees who had good relations, you sometimes had the sale from the Jewish owner to the non-Jewish employee, and then the Jew would continue to work there until they were prohibited by statute from working for that particular business. So one of the things I didn't talk about is that after the Reich citizenship law, you had profession-specific orders, which were that, like, Jewish doctors either can't practice or they can only practice on Jewish patients. Jewish instrumentalists can't serve in the Berlin Philharmonic. I mean, all that kind of stuff. So ultimately Jews were pushed out of business, but the boycott did not stick for a long time.
So you said that a lot of judges who were Jewish could retain their position. I was wondering if you know how it impacted their work and their influence, I guess, in the court.
Yeah, so they were eventually kicked off the bench. So they were not all kicked out in April of 1933, and I don't remember the date, but at a time later, they were taken off the bench and taken out of the bar. So ultimately, they were not, doing this kind of thing. I have to tell you, one of the questions is from a friend of mine from high school, from Cleveland Heights High School, who just says, "Hi, Kathy." Hi, Ruth.
It's a twofold question. So in terms of the Holocaust, there were other groups of people that were obviously persecuted. I'm assuming that the gay/lesbian community probably fell under the hereditary courts in terms of, but what about Romani people and other groups of races that were considered non-German?
So first of all, I think that it's important to note that a lot of victims of the Nazi government didn't go to court at all, especially outside of Germany. So, in Germany, there was more of this sense of preserving the structure of government. When you got to, Poland, where the Einsatzgruppen just went and shot people, there was none of that. So it's really important to distinguish those two. Also, with preventive custody and the rights to arrest people without charge if they were about to commit something, or supposedly about to commit something, it was quite easy to arrest people for no reason at all. There were certainly, Berlin was known as a very gay town in the 20s. And so there was a lot of persecution against the homosexual community in Germany. I don't know if they were ever taken to the hereditary health court laws, because the point of that was to stop procreation of people with hereditary health issues. And of course, I don't think they were too concerned about gay people procreating. So, but yeah, there was certainly persecution of other kinds. So the courts were not the only instrumentality of persecution. Interestingly, in Germany, before you were deported as a Jew, you actually got a legal notice that you were going to be deported, and you were told where to report and when, and yada, yada, yada. Again, by the time you get to other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, that's not the case.
Thank you. And then can you expand on your opera a little bit?
Sure. That was how I got interested in all of this. I started doing research for what became The Sparks Fly Upward, which is this opera that I wrote. Even though it's about the Holocaust, it's not depressing. It's really about, you know, our obligations as humans when stuff like this happens in the world. And we now know that, you know, even though Nazi Germany was horrific, it wasn't the only one. We've had, you know, all kinds of genocides since then. And of course, you know, there is, you know, a current threat to democracy in many, many places in the world. So anyway, so the opera is hopeful because it's about being aware and being engaged and the individual choices that we make. And it hasn't been performed in like 10 years and it's being performed here in June. So I hope you'll all be there. And auditions are this weekend if you happen to sing and you want to come audition. So, and again, it's called The Sparks Fly Upward. It'll be at the Maltz Performing Arts Center. And I'm sure the law school will do some, you know, stuff about how to get tickets and stuff like that. So, yeah.
So as far as I'm aware, in the United States, there were these one-drop laws regarding racial purity in the South and in many other parts of the country, meant to sort of discriminate against the African-American community in this country, saying if you had one drop of Black blood, you were Black, and that was meant to disenfranchise people. There is this idea that a lot of Nazi racial purity laws came as a result of, you know, the studying of these laws conducted here in this country. Is this true? Is there a correlation between these Nazi racial purity laws and what occurred in this country?
Yes, I think there is. And even it's not in this presentation, but there was even like a chart to show who was a Jew and who wasn't. That looks very much like the chart that you may have seen in high school over who's Black and who isn't. And you know, eugenics started in the United States and became the basis of the hereditary health courts and the sterilization effort. There's a really great American Experience segment on eugenics and the role that the United States played in setting that foundation for what happened in Nazi Germany. So yeah, it definitely came. We were definitely part of the backing for the whole notion that you could determine someone's race by their blood, and you know, also that there were good races and bad races. And you may know this, but you know, there were the one drop statutes in the United States, but there were also these categorizations of people as like octoroons, and you know, based on if you were 1/8 Black, and it affected what you could do, whether you could vote, whether you were covered by certain laws. So yeah, we certainly played a role in setting the ground for that. Yeah.
There's so much you could talk about.
Yes, there is.
But both what's going on now and what's been going on for the last 20, 30 years, going back to what he was just talking about. So was the argument back then, don't question the science of eugenics?
You mean like the argument now?
No, the argument then, don't question the science of eugenics, was used by the Nazis to justify what they were doing.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but I think at the time
I'm
it
just
was
saying,
just,
like, now there's all this, don't question the science, accept the science.
oh, I see what you're saying. So like
And
we're being,
has government changed really in the last 100 years? Are they still doing the same thing of whatever will justify the way they want to go, they're going to use? If it doesn't, then just ignore that.
yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is. I haven't seen anyone point to the eugenics science as a reason for questioning science now. I really don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying now. I'm just saying at that time, there's a lot of people who accepted eugenics as a legitimate science.
That's true.
And so that was the science of the day then. And so now people are saying, hey, you can't question the science. What are the sciences today? And it's being used to, you know, whereas to me, true science is always questioning, always asking to what, you know, what are the results of this? Let's explore it further. Let's keep examining and always keep looking, because, you know, Pluto was a planet when I was a kid. That was the science. Now he's not. Now Pluto's not a planet. And that's a minor thing, but science is always changing. But I'm just looking, I'll be real specific, the terrorist laws that they've passed, which, and again, the names that you have, it's, whatever it is, the Patriot Act or whatever. The last time they passed that, they put laws in there that basically they can hold US citizens without trial and without charges indefinitely. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. And I'm not sure if that's what's going on with all the people from who.
Well, let me just sort of say, I think that I'd be hard pressed to find a current situation where science was justified as a basis, as a pretext for genocide, which, that was clearly what was happening then. So, I don't know, even the Muslim ban, Trump's Muslim ban was not actually a Muslim ban. It might have been a proxy for a Muslim ban, but it wasn't based on some science that Muslims are inferior to the rest of humans or something. So I don't know that there's a straight correlation there. Though that is how genocide happens, is you divide people based on you're better, you're worse, and then you get people into a frenzy. I mean, I give that lecture to high schools, right? That like tolerance and diversity are the first steps to genocide. Now, one's way over here and the other one's way over there, but definitely dividing into groups can serve as the first step to genocide. And you see that in Rwanda, you see it in every country where there's been a genocide.
What role beyond lending extra legitimacy do you think that the preservation of formalism in the law and
the preservation of what?
Being very keeping with the legal formalities might have played beyond lending legitimacy?
Also something we talk about in my class. There's a really great law review article that I assigned by David Lubin in the class that talks about the fact that for a lot of lawyers, like the Nuremberg laws came out and they were like, oh, let's get to work. And we sat down and we did what lawyers do, right? Who's a Jew? Who isn't? Oh, you're a Jew, you're not. And so there wasn't like that step back to think about whether the law itself was moral or immoral. Now, it's easy for us to look back and say that was clearly an immoral law and lawyers and judges should not have enforced it. But think about the times in our own country where people have refused to follow laws because they thought they were immoral. And that also poses a problem. So it's a really tricky, complex analysis, right? So the example I always use is the person in, I think it was Alabama, who was working for wherever you got your marriage license and would not issue a marriage license to any gay couples. That person was looking at the requirements of a statute and of a constitutional decision and saying that offends my moral sense. And so I'm not going to follow it. Now, why is that person wrong and someone who won't follow the Nuremberg laws right? Do you know what I mean? So I'm not taking a position on either of those. I'm just saying that I think these things in real time are much more complex, because we also don't want people just flouting the letter of the law, but we also want people to have a moral compass and a moral center. And where those two meet is very fraught.
Are there any virtual questions?
Yeah, let me just quickly look. Sorry, it's hard to read while I'm doing this. The question is, of all the jurists who survived the war, how many were subsequently treated as war criminals? How many continue to practice law in post-war Germany? That's a really interesting question. So, the Nuremberg trials themselves really only went after very few people. So you had the major war crimes trials, which I had 24 defendants, I can't remember. And then you had another, I think there were 9 more trials that were industry specific. So you had a medical case, you had an Eisensgruppen case, you had a case about the camps, you had a case about industry. that left a lot of jurists and lawyers not tried in the Nuremberg trials, but there were many, many domestic trials in Germany in the various sectors of Germany. So, there was the American sector and the French sector. There were trials in, a lot of the countries that tried people who had participated. Then you also had jurists and lawyers who went through a process called denazification, which was a way that they could get their credentials back and continue practicing. So the answer is not one single answer. A lot of different things happen. Can you adjust the screen so we can see the presenter? Too late. What helped Hitler to arrest his political opponents before the parliament elects their leader? What was the reaction from the German public? I don't know the answer about the German public, but it was the just previous passing of the preventive detention law and protective custody that allowed Hitler to take those people into custody. When did the ghetto structure start? I actually don't know the answer to that. My guess is late 40, early 41, but I'm not positive. Another alumni from Cleveland Heights High School saying hi. Hi, Ken Myers. This is great. This is one of the best things about Zoom, right? Resistance, quiet or otherwise, within the bureaucracy that may have either falsified documents or otherwise poured sand on the gears. It's a really good question. And I don't know that there was small resistance like that in the government. There were certainly, efforts like Stauffenberg and others to actually assassinate Hitler or terminate the government. But I don't know about small bureaucratic efforts. Although I will say, going back to your question about the opera, those are the kinds of things that the opera focuses on, is those single decisions by small people. We're not talking Schindler's List. We're talking, I did something small and maybe it jammed up the gears just a little bit. What was happening in the court of public opinion was their media. Yes, there was a lot of media, and a lot of it was, the main one, Der Stürmer, was very anti-Semitic, very supportive of the Nazi government. I've seen pictures of, they used to put copies of Der Stürmer on the street corners so that everyone was getting exposed to that. They also rode through the streets with vehicles that had loudspeakers, and they could read the news as they wanted people to hear it that way. There was a decree that banned Germans from listening to the BBC, because of course, Britain's not that far away, especially in Western Germany. And you weren't allowed to listen to international news. So there was definitely this cutoff of news, but there was also, up until the late 1940, and maybe even into early 1941, there were a whole host of Jewish newspapers, like 15 of them or so, just in Berlin, that were trying to help people through this whole thing. That's another whole lecture. There was Jewish Winter Relief. There was even an orchestra that was supported by the Nazis in order to kind of turn Jews away from protesting what was happening to them. So yeah, a lot of media, but a lot of it propaganda. There's a great exhibit at the Holocaust Museum in Washington in the basement on propaganda and the Nazis, and I highly recommend it if you're ever there. Gabe, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Professor Mansfield.
Hi.
Thank you so much for giving this really interesting talk. So my question is, President Hindenburg, I think you mentioned that he was elected, but he wasn't a fan of democracy. One, it's kind of weird to be elected and not be a fan of democracy. But two, what sort of government was he trying to restore the monarchy? Was that like the conservative agenda at that time?
I'm not really sure what his personal views were on what should happen. So I don't really know that I have the capacity to answer the question. But clearly he was willing to participate. And the reason he appointed Hitler as chancellor was that, they figured it was better to do a coalition government with the Nazis, even though they were far right of the nationalists, rather than form a coalition government with one of the left or center parties like, the Socialist Worker Party. So what was he thinking individually in terms of how he balanced his anti-government, sense with his role in the government? I don't really know. He was really quite decrepit by the time a lot of this went on. He had been a war hero, long before, but I don't really know, why he didn't just say, I'm just not going to participate in this. Okay, let me just quickly look through. Oh, the activity code for the CLE. That seems like a good question to end with. I apologize, I didn't get to everybody's questions. But do you have the code, or do we have a slide with the code? Okay, so we'll put up a slide with the code. And I just want to thank you all for coming out on this snowy Holocaust Remembrance Day. And thank you to those of you that attended online. We really appreciate you attending online. Thanks.